Hello, I'm Rachel DeGuzman. I'm the producer of engagement programs at Geva Theater Center, and I'm happy to welcome you to the Geva Prologue on Somewhere Over the Border. Geva Prologues are lively, informative, pre-recorded chats that connect directors, designers, and cast members with regional creatives, thinkers, and doers. Prologues delve more deeply into the world beyond the script by exploring a play's origin, providing context, and sometimes the creative process that shaped the production. Geva Prologues are productions of the engagement department at Geva. And so I'm so happy to welcome Dr. Anna Gómez Parga. She's here from Nazareth College, one of our local thinkers. And Rebecca Marínez, who's the director of Somewhere Over the Border. And I'm going to fade to black as they have a conversation. Okay, bye-bye.
So, hi, I'm Anna Gómez Parga. I am a professor of media at Nazareth College at the moment, but tonight I want to start this conversation as a Mexican immigrant that I am. I read the story. I am sort of familiar with Brian Quijada's work. And when I was reading like the experiences, the characters and everything else, they hit home to me. I'm from Chihuahua, Mexico. I'm a border person, but I always tell people I'm from the other side of the border, because when you talk about borders, especially the US-Mexico border, people assume that you're from Texas or from Arizona or places like that, but I'm actually from Mexico. I'm not a first generation or third generation. I am the person who crossed the border. So when I was reading the story about the American dream, about the expectations, about what you think life is like, based on all of these narratives that you form about the United States, the houses, the lifestyle, everything else, I could relate to a lot of what was being said. Tonight, I hope that we get a chance to talk about narratives. That is my area of specialty. I look at media from the perspective that media does, and media and stories and mediated stories do two things for you. They naturalize narratives, or they normalize narratives. And yeah, like as an introduction, that's where I stand. I don't know, Rebecca, if you want to briefly tell us who you are. And nice to meet you, by the way.
Yeah, likewise. Nice to meet you. Nice to be in conversation with you. Yeah. Oh, well, Rebecca Marínez is my name. I um, I have a very different, I would say, personal relationship to what the border means. My family is. I have the Martinez side of my family is from the what is now known as the U.S. and Colorado. Or, I'm sorry, New Mexico and Colorado. And my family has been there since the border has changed several times, and what the area is known as now has changed several times throughout many centuries. And like I have indigenous ancestors who have been in that area, and then I have ancestors who were the first colonizers who came up from Mexico. And so like just the way we talk about it is that we didn't cross the border crossed us. So thinking of like what that means when people are separated because of arbitrary lines that are drawn up by governments for many different reasons, is something that I think about a lot, particularly as and someone who, like, I do a lot of work, a lot of just especially as a Latina director, I'm asked to tell a lot of stories that are Latina stories, and so many of those do have that are rooted in other countries in Latin America, that are rooted in like, what does that mean if we are here in this one country, but yet we have roots in another country, and thinking about that in between, and the multiple identities that are carried, and the complexity that lives around that is something that is very much a part of my work.
Yeah, that complexity of stories, right? I've heard a lot of. I could say, like, I understand one of my privileges being that of not having to think of Mexico as where my roots are, but Mexico is my whole identity. For me, most of my life, borders were just geographical borders divided by political frontiers, right? But then the more you learn about the multiple stories of colonization, right, even in my own state of Chihuahua, and the history behind all that, you get to understand just how many layers are there. I don't know what you say, that you are constantly being asked to represent Latino stories, right? What would you say, I guess, how do you engage with that complexity through these stories? That would be a question for you.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things is who is helping me tell the stories and who is in the space, and how we think about putting the teams together, including like folks who are designers, folks who are in the space, who are the writers. Those are all very important things, because the one thing that I love so much about Somewhere Over the Border is that, in a sense, I feel like we got to tell the story in the way that feels important to us. And that Brian was in the room the whole time, that we were able to tell a story that's not very often seen, which is the story of people from El Salvador, and just having the space and freedom to be able to tell that in a way that felt important to us, without another lens of being on and saying, like, this is how I think it is, this is how I think it is. And I think that's a tremendous gift that doesn't always happen. There have been other situations where I have been invited to participate in storytelling that did not ring true, because the creators, it was not there was not a cultural connection, or or an ethnic connection, or actually a connection to subject matter at all, but wanted to tell somebody else's story. And those are the kinds of stories that I have a little question about. And in some cases, I feel like I actually can't participate in this unless I have enough people and enough agency, that if there is a question about something, if there is something that is not ringing true, then are we able to change it? Are we able to impact it? So I think a lot of my work, especially as someone who does not have a background as close as many folks do to, with roots in another country, or who have moved from a country outside of the place that is the U.S., is that it's still a family story, even though my family is recent, because I do have immigrants in my family. And but really thinking about, like, who are the people that we bring along, and how do we make sure that those folks whose stories are being told are involved in the storytelling process is critical.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting that you say that, because right now this semester I'm teaching a class called Representation in Media. And a lot of my students believe that it's just a matter of having more Latinx cast members, or more Black faces, or more brown bodies in the play. And when we start engaging with issues of mis and underrepresentation or overrepresentation, that's where we start seeing how important it is that the creators, the writers, the producers, the directors, also are, like, diverse and from the actual backgrounds that we're trying to put forward. So I'm happy to hear that you're thinking in that process. What would you say is the main challenge in trying to actually have these representative process, or how challenging is it? Because that's a question most of my students have, like, okay, so why can't we do that?
Mm-hmm. I think the challenge is different based on the media and how much agency a person has in the role that they're in.
Okay.
And I mean, I think about it as someone who identifies as a director, who is identified in many cases as like a lead creative. as part of my practice, I try to figure out how to dismantle hierarchy, but often directors are put in a place of hierarchy, as in we got to make a lot of decisions, but also thinking about like how do we think about inviting people in, and then once we invite people in, how do we think about giving them agency in the storytelling itself? So it's not like, okay, I am going to make all the decisions as the director. It is how are we together as this ensemble going to tell the story? That's something that's important for my practice. And it isn't necessarily the same in other spaces, but I think, I mean, honestly, it is getting more folks in the field. I feel there's a couple things. Getting more folks in the field who are across the board in lots of different positions, and having that access, getting that access, and then getting the opportunities, because a lot of the lack of representation comes from exclusion. And so how to think about that, and exclusion because of a lot of reasons. Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's people hire who they know, and if they only like invite people in a certain circle, they're not bringing in other people. So there's lots and lots of reasons why access has historically been an issue, and to equity and representation. But I think also that one of the things is how to say no, and how to realize that if you don't have agency of project, you always can say no and ask for what you need. And if you're not getting it, you can say no. And I have known, like these past couple of years, with how people are embracing this idea of, I will no longer take this. I will no longer take mistreatment. I will no longer take exclusion. With all the racial reckoning that has been really prominent in so many spaces. It is also giving folks the ability to speak and advocate for themselves in a different way. And I think that becomes, I think that's only going to help more, because people won't put up with it anymore. Like a lot of people are like, I'm not going to put up with this. I'm not going to put up with mistreatment. When I used to feel like this is the only option I had, it's not. I can have other options. So I think so I sort of like got off track a little bit into
I have two questions for you, if you don't mind me asking. Number one, given the current conversations about the Great Resignation and how people are beginning to say no and advocating for themselves and better working conditions, do you think that is also being reflected in theater?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. That's great news.
Yeah. And some of it is like, the theater has always been a place where it's like, we do it for the love, we don't do it for the money. And that's still the case in a lot of places. But there are jobs that are feeling that are also being harder to fill, and people are asking for more, and they're asking for things that they need, and they're also asking for certain conditions to be put upon, and asking for that agency, and not across the board, but I think it is only healthy and only going to keep propelling this idea forward and this agency forward.
That's good. My second is more of a commentary related to the content of the play. So I hear you saying that, I don't know if I misheard you, can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what I heard you say is that there was this feeling that there is an underrepresentation of stories from El Salvador and this migration, right? And when I was reading it, because this is the second piece of work that I come across of Brian Quijada, I went to another panel. Actually, colleagues of mine were part of that panel discussion. And as the immigrant woman that I am, one of the things that are highly triggering for me and painful is this perpetuation of America, first of all, as America as just in the name. For many people in Latin America, America is the entire continent. So just based off of that, like that's almost like like the first roadblock to resistance, and like we refuse to call it America, right? Because that means that we are sub-America, meaning Latin America, meaning South America, Central America, wherever. And then this notion that America is a promised land, and therefore Latin America is savage land, and dreams are only possible once you reach that promised land. And I see very little engagement with why that is. So in Mexico, and I'm going to talk because I'm not as well versed in El Salvador, right? But in Mexico, I can tell you, in the same way that you saw the border cross you, we saw like the economic imperialism of the US coming down since the 90s, right? And the more we've learned, the more we've come to realize that it's not migration what we're talking about, is displacement. When you all of a sudden see your resources, whether that's water or resources or labor being stripped, right? And all of a sudden your only options for work are exploitation through maquilas that we have all of the border in Mexico, right? You're forced to migrate. That's not a choice you make, right? And so we're talking about displacement because it wasn't voluntary in many ways. It was survival. And when I was reading the first half of this play, like the perpetuation of America, the house is America, life is great, America, children are happy, America, I could feel my blood boiling. There's a sense of pain and resistance and being like, wait a minute, first of all, can we talk about America in January 2021? Can we talk about Flint, Michigan, right? Can we talk about native, like indigenous nations being stripped from their water and resources in here within these borders, right? There isn't one America and nothing is all of that. And I appreciated that by the second half of the story, we really got to touch on just how brutal the reality of an immigrant are, right? When you're exploited by having to clean houses for very low pay and then having to work like everywhere else and having to wait for a decade to be able to see your family again. But I don't feel like those narratives were balanced. And so I don't know, like this is the second time I crave those stories as well. I crave that story of historicizing, first of all, why is it that this country still has something to offer? And second of all, what is the actual reality that you face as an immigrant? Because it's not this promised land that you just touch and all of a sudden everything is great. You touch and it's still more work, more exploitation, more violence in many different ways. So I don't know. Any comments on that?
Yeah, a lot, and a lot of just acknowledgement as well of all the U.S. governmental policies in all throughout Central America, South America, all throughout Latin America that has completely destabilized countries' economies in many different ways, and then that has made it like, I think the thing about that I think about a lot, that we thought about a lot in terms of making the show, particularly, was just the fact that a lot of people, a lot of families have no desire to leave.
Right.
They don't want to leave. They want to be where they are. They don't want to move away, and but are forced to by circumstances. And I think with some of that is also like, because it's also a mashup of the Wizard of Oz. So there's this playfulness in between. And then also thinking that this happened in the 1970s, which is a little different than now. And that it was thinking about like, what is the story of the person whose life we're trying to tell, which is Brian's mom. And just really like, there's a lot of considerations just within that, but knowing that most people who would be watching it would be people who would be like, oh yeah, of course, I was raised with the American dream. I know what the American dream is. Of course, everybody wants to come here. Of course, the Statue of Liberty. Of course, bringing me You're Tired and Poor. and then we get to the place where it's like, actually, no, this is the reality, is where it lands. And part of it was like, you know, how much space and time do you want to give to each story, and how much is it that at the end of the day, this is a story about a mother and son who are trying to figure out their relationship again after 10 years of separation, and we don't even know. Like, that's the part of the play we can't get into.
Yeah.
And
And again, like, sorry, keep going.
No, I was just going to say that I think I'm in some circles of folks who are talking about like musicals written by Latina writers, new musicals, and there's very few. And I think just the fact that there's a dearth of work makes every single one that comes out feel very important in a way it wouldn't if it was, I mean, and, you know, like in a way that feels kind of weighted sometimes, in a way that's not necessarily helpful. If there were like 500 musicals about El Salvador, and just like there are like 500 musicals about, people singing in the park in New York City, I don't know. And so just thinking about just the need to have not just one story, but many stories out there. So one story doesn't have to carry all that weight.
And that is the unfairness of underrepresentation. And that's what I teach. Like, it's completely unfair that we demand every single story from one person and one author.
Yep.
Especially when we know that we're given very little opportunity. So I remember, I don't know if you're familiar with Cristela. She's a Mexican American comedian. And she created her own show, right? And people criticized her, like, that's not my story. And she responded by saying, that's why the show is called Cristela. You know, like, and I understand that, but I guess in the same way that I'm seeing people finally advocating for better working conditions after a long time, especially in the arts, and especially in teaching, and especially in all these areas, I wish I could feel optimistic about our ability to begin to tell multiple stories and begin to engage with those histories of intervention and those histories of U.S. responsibility, especially after Trump's presidency and this narrative of shithole countries and the third world and build the world, and this is why they're coming, and the immigrant invasion. I don't know, like, as an immigrant myself, I wish we could tell more stories about why is it that there's a need to migrate in the first place.
Yeah. And I think, again, coming back, who is the author of the story, who are the creator of the story, and sort of like the lens and the viewpoint, and what does it mean if you are like first generation and your story is different than someone who has moved from another country, which is different from like someone who's third generation, you know. So there's like so many different stories in there. And just thinking about like Brian's story, for example, how he was born in the US. Of course, we know his brother was born in El Salvador. But just thinking, like, as someone who was raised in the US with parents, like his first language is Spanish, like all this type of cultural background, and he's also like, he's one of those people that I feel are writing two different cultures. And it's also interesting when it's like, here's the artist and here's the art. And and for this show, it is the same, you know, it is a deep reflection of the artist himself. And I think, again, I come back to like how, like, I feel it coming, I feel it happening.
Okay.
And it's not happening as quickly as we need it, but it is happening. And I think it's the other thing, the platform, because English is the dominant language in this country, even though it's not the only language. And but it's the language that is like given the most placement. And there are so many stories that are in Spanish that are not given that that space as well. And I mean, I don't have a fix, of course. If I did, I mean, we
Right.
wouldn't be
And
having
if
this
I
conversation.
did, I wouldn't be teaching. I keep telling the students.
Yeah, but I just keep coming back to like we just have to do it. We can't quit. And every time I'm like, it's so hard, I gotta quit. Like I can't, because if I don't do it, I spent a lot of years advocating for Latina artists to tell your stories, to do the stuff, to like push things forward, and then I realized that is my responsibility as well. I have to do it. And I think that's one of the things that keeps me going, is that if like I quit, what if everybody quits? Then there's none of it.
Yeah. Do you think that's another border perhaps that we need to cross, the language barrier?
Yeah. I think there's so many incredible artists I know that have such fluidity in both languages. And and then there's folks that are judged because they don't speak English, and folks that are judged because they don't speak Spanish. And then there are folks that are just like cool with whatever. And for many folks, it is like, it's art, whether it's in English or Spanish, it doesn't matter. Also, there's not the binary of just English and Spanish. There are many languages that are in this country. Those are the dominant colonizer languages.
The colonizing languages, yes, exactly.
Continent. And I think that sometimes this is how the colonizers win, is they get in the way, and we put these divisions in our mind when we're creating and thinking we cannot do this because of this reason, when really there's abundance and space for all of the making to happen together.
Yeah, I don't know if you know this, but I created the first Spanish event at Nazareth College. And everybody told me it was going to fail completely because people were not fluent in Spanish. And it actually was a massive success. And one of the things talking about borders is this quote, I'm blanking on the name, but this quote of like the internal border, la frontera interna, which needs to be crossed when we feel that there's a limit, right? We think that, okay, this is the best that I can get in a job. This is the most that I can get in representation. This is it. But then if we cross that mental border as well, right, then we can create like magic potentially. I don't know. I'm very optimistic with what you're telling me. I appreciate the fact that you're being so thoughtful about the whole play. But I also felt the need that I needed to express my need and my craving for
the
content.
And I agree. There needs to be more. Yeah. And I think the other thing that is connected to the quote that you just gave, like the border in the mind, the internal border, is in so many spaces, because the way that Latina artists have been often excluded, and companies have been underfunded, and institutions have been excluded from major pipelines of funding, and as well as like a lot of times, because I started out a Latina theater company, and I've worked with several that are the same age as like these big massive companies that have lots and lots of money and have lots and lots of support. And there's sometimes this space that has been put on us by others, and then sometimes it is this space of like, oh, I actually can't leave that, when we can make space, a larger space for ourselves in the field, or in like the national field, but also, it's also a lot of work, because you're fighting against so many things. And sometimes it's like, I just, maybe I just need to be around folks where I don't have to fight all the time. Exactly. But then it becomes a different sort of struggle, because then it's like, okay, it would be nice to work someplace where there's resources. Yes. Where there's support, which we don't always have in smaller companies. And so I think all those borders are continuously apart.
Yes.
And not always the most helpful in the making.
Right. And the very reality, like these, I don't know if you ever saw these meme going on that when you go to a museum in Europe, you have like rooms after rooms after room for Leonardo da Vinci, and then you have one room in like the entire continent of Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, yeah, they colonized not just our lands, not just our countries, but our minds, and they made us believe that we have to fight for this one place when we could be pushing for more spaces.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm glad that we're doing just that.
We are trying. And I think part of that is that has been happening with theater artists, is that we have been not just looking in our own little bubbles, but looking outside to each other and knowing that there's lots of different ways to go about it. And some folks are like, I don't want to get bigger because I don't want to deal with all that, the stuff that comes along with it. But my experience has been that as we have been able to connect, and I'm using like as I was part of a sort of like a commons, a volunteer and part of a commons that was all about the advocacy for moving Latina theater in this country forward in the US. And it really became about how do we see ourselves? How do we see each other? How do we connect? How do we organize? And how do we push some stuff forward? So that if we didn't get visibility, okay, we're going to ask for it. We're going to demand it, and we're going to make stuff happen. And you come see us. You come see us now. We are now the ones you come look at. And we're making the platform for ourselves. And that's another tactic. That's another way of working. But and that we'll band together. Like together we rise. Together we do this. Together we'll figure it out. Together we'll find a way. And I really, really believe in the strength in numbers, and I really believe in organizing and finding those coalitions in creative spaces as well as community spaces. Like it's the same principles.
Yeah. Well, I said I was from Mexico, right? And when I was living in Texas, a lot of us were hesitant to call ourselves Latinas. We were like, we're Mexican. And one of the things that I've always advocated for is because there's power in numbers, and many of our stories resonate with each other, and we are incredibly misunderstood as a cultural mass. So yeah. Together we rise. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's, like Latina is a word that has brought people together, lumped people together, united people, but also like in a way that can also be very problematic because it's not homogenous. It's not, it is a mix of cultures, of languages, of backgrounds, and all that sort of thing. And so I think recognizing that, which is I think even more critical, that we have as many stories as possible.
Owning it as a social movement, perhaps, but always with this critical lens that there's still a lot to unpack there, perhaps.
We do have a big nod to Mexico in the show, though.
Good. I'm happy to hear that.
It was like we had a moment in the show where we're like, all right, this is from Mexico. This is for the Mexicans. So we made a big... Because one of the bus stops is in Guadalajara.
I know, I saw. And then you were talking about tequila and how you need to oil your bones. And I felt that, I'm telling you. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.